This has been a transformative year for Pfizer. You've announced that you're going to split off your older drugs division and focus Pfizer on biopharmaceutical innovation. Can you talk to us a little bit about what areas you're going to prioritize and how you're going to replace some of those blockbusters like Lyrica and Lipitor that are going to go into a different part of the business now?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here, Cynthia. It's great to meet you. Truly, it is a very exciting time for Pfizer right now. And it's all the more exciting because we are a true New York company. In fact, we've been in New York for 170 years. We started in Brooklyn, in Williamsburg, actually, making antibiotics for the Second World War, penicillin. And if I think about where we were and how far we've come to this moment in time in 2019, where we are on the brink of delivering a pipeline that is so exciting. That really is the reason that we are creating the new Pfizer with a focus on innovative science in the way that we are. When we actually separate the pieces of our company that we have been contemplating, so in July we announced that we would be spinning off our consumer business and forming a joint venture with GlaxoSmithKline. We announced that we will be doing a merger of a piece of our post-patent business that was called the Upjohn division, and that we would be combining that with Mylan. That was all for the purpose of creating a science-based and a purely science-based focused company that we call Biopharma. And that's really important for us. The 10 years of investments that we have made into our pipeline have brought us to this point now where we are in a place with incredible breakthroughs that we can contemplate. We have developed the skills and the expertise to deliver more of those breakthroughs. And over the last several years, we've also been very explicit in terms of trimming the therapeutic areas and the disease areas that we want to play in so that we can really triple down and do more in those disease areas that we have proclaimed to be the ones that we think we can be great at. So those are diseases that you all know well: oncology, inflammation and immunology, vaccines, internal medicine, our hospital business unit, as well as a rare disease business unit. And so with these 6 business units, these are the priorities that we believe we have both the capability, both on the scientific side as well as on the commercial side, in order to really create impact on society. So it's a brave new moment for us. We've always been in this business, as you know, but I think that we were in it alongside with many other things. And as you know, it is, we're really going to create the impact. With the size of impact and the extent of the impact we want, we have to focus. And these strategic moves that we've made around why we are creating these new business units that we are, as well as separating ourselves from businesses that were not core to our innovation agenda, were all important ways for us to get to this moment. And that's why this moment is so exciting.
So talk to us a little bit about gene therapy. It's one of the hottest areas in pharma, and for those of you who haven't been following to the minute, it's where we're starting to see cures for diseases we didn't even have treatments for prior. But these are one-time therapies, and the first what we're seeing in the very early stages is big price tags because they represent a big shift in how we pay for healthcare and what it means going forward. Talk to us a little bit about how you see the landscape, how you see this playing out, and how gene therapy is going to maybe change the way we have to figure out how to pay for drugs.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, gene therapy really is at the forefront of science. What gene therapy does, actually, is that it looks for a defective gene in your DNA. And what it does is that it fixes that gene. And in fixing that gene, that is how you manage the disease. So that's a pretty tall order. Scientifically difficult, sort of a difficult frontier of science to accomplish. Certainly, you can imagine also from a manufacturing, right? So you might have the mechanism right, but now you have to make enough drug to be able to dose that into the patient. So when we talk about gene therapy, it really is just a world of wonders in so many different ways, because it's not just about the concept of how you can repair a gene, but it's sort of like, how do you do that? So we're very active in this space. We ourselves have 3 programs in gene therapy, in hemophilia A and hemophilia B, as well as in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. But gene therapies are really today meant for monogenic diseases, meaning where you have a single mutation that you need to repair. And there are about 3,000 of those diseases alone. And today, there are probably about 10,000 active programs looking at diseases in this area. So let's pretend that 10% of everything that is being researched today actually comes to pass. You start to see that potentially gene therapy can become a mainstay therapy in how we manage diseases of the future, especially these monogenic diseases. So it's a really exciting time from a scientific perspective. But as you said, because you're fixing the gene or you're replacing the gene, actually, you're replacing the gene and you're correcting and allowing the human body then to return to a normal state, what that means is it's like a cure. Right? It's almost like you don't have that anymore. And so it does tee up a much larger question around how does one, what is that worth, and how does one pay for it? And you can imagine that that's a very far cry from where we are today with some of the therapies that we have, where these are monthly therapies that you may take for years, like our cholesterol medication or our hypertension medication. I mean, we're talking about a level of science and a level of precision. That's what the big difference is, a level of precision that it's purely for that individual. And that brings to the forefront large questions around, how do you pay for cures? What is that worth? And what does that look like? And certainly, I think what it does mean is that you can't pay for it in the way that we pay for it today, which is month by month or, whatever however we look at it. We're paying today for medicines almost like a pill. Right? You pay per pill, when what we're looking at here is you're paying for an outcome, your cure. And so that is definitely going to, it brings to the forefront a shift in the way that we think about how we pay for medicines. And I think that over the next several years, as we see gene therapies be launched, so today there are 2 gene therapies launched, one in a neurological condition, one in an optical condition. But as you see more of these come to pass, it will necessarily drive us to come up with solutions and different solutions other than the ones that we have today. And we are already in active discussions with our payers to begin to brainstorm, what does that look like, and how do we manage this? So good news is we're starting early to think about it. But I think what's most exciting in this entire description of gene therapies is what's possible for patients.
Do you think that installment-based payments, which is one topic that's been thrown around where, yes, it might be a very high price tag, but it ends up being paid out in installments, is the way of the future? Or do you think that too much mimics what we already have and we have to get our heads around these lump sum, one-time upfront payments in order to deliver these drugs?
Honestly, I think that they can happen in a number of ways. But I think that there are many approaches, we call them subscription approaches, or, in more layman's terms, we think about it like we call it the Netflix model, right? Like a subscription model. Honestly, like I said, I think there are a number of ways that you can think about it, and one could be very creative. I think what is the more important theme of future payments is how do you think about outcomes? Pay for outcomes. Pay for things when they work. Don't pay for things when they don't work. And today we don't really do that, right? We pay per pill. When, in fact, what we'd like to do is to shift the conversation much more towards a place where we can talk about the value that we provide to patients, the value we provide to society, and how do you pay for that. So it's a very different frame and a framework for thinking about future possible reimbursement models.
Why do you think it's been so hard to move towards an outcome-based model? Because it's a conversation the industry has been having for years, and it sounds as though everyone's on the same page in theory, but in practice it seems to be really hard to get off the ground. What do you think is holding that up?
Well, there are a number of things. I mean, first of all, it begins with the availability of outcomes, right? So you need data. And some clinical trials and some drugs lend themselves very well to measuring outcomes, and some are more difficult. So just hypothetically, as an example, if you take a drug where you can easily measure how many days less you're spending in a hospital, that's a very hard outcome. That's very easy to measure, and that comes with very obvious ways of quantifying that. There are other diseases that are more difficult. So not impossible, but more difficult. So it doesn't necessarily rise to the top as an obvious and an easy thing to do, right? Because you need the availability of data to determine the outcome, and that whatever that outcome is, you necessarily need to be able to quantify it. And your ability to do that is what will then determine whether you can or cannot use an outcomes-based measurement. But that's kind of the way we need to think about it, even though it is difficult. We haven't collected that data because that's not how we pay for it today. Yep. But maybe we should. Yeah. So I think it just opens up, a much wider aperture for us to think about payment systems that don't even exist today. And I think that, paying for value and paying for impact is certainly something that needs to be contemplated. And in a world now where you have much more precise medicines, right? You're targeting single genes, you're targeting single mutations, you can be much more pointed with finding those outcomes than we ever have, because science has gotten us there, or science is getting us there.
Now, some of these gene therapies that are under development are for diseases where there are much larger patient populations than others. Do you think the markets are going to behave differently, much like the rare disease drugs are, versus drugs that hit a very large patient population? And the reason I ask is because some of the early gene therapies are very expensive. The question becomes, can the healthcare system absorb that much cost in some diseases where there is a much larger patient population? So I'm curious to see how you think that will.
Well, today, when we say gene therapy, we really mean the 3,000 possible diseases. And these 3,000 diseases are rare diseases, so they're very, very small populations. So that's really only scientifically what's available to us today. When we say gene therapy, we're really talking rare diseases that affect a few people. When we talk about medications, or I should say precision medicine, medicines that target specific mutations, that's not a gene therapy anymore. So I think about some of our cancer medications, they would be good examples of that. But that's still not massive numbers of people. That's like not nearly the order of what you would get, say, from a hypertensive population or from a diabetes population. So we're still quite far from getting to the masses from that perspective. But, science will evolve, and we will learn more and more about the genetic makeup of people and what that means, both from a detection perspective as well as from a treatment perspective. But I think what we're talking about today and the realm of science we're in is in small to smaller populations, but not the en masse yet. And not to say that it couldn't come, but that's not where we are if we think about what's out there in the next 5 to 7 years.
Now, you are developing drugs in patient populations that are much larger, like a non-opioid pain alternative with tanezumab, and you're working in antibiotics still. For years, people said those markets were broken, and that because there was so much generic drug in the system and it was so cheap, there wasn't much economic incentive to develop drugs to compete with that. Can you talk a little bit about whether or not that dynamic has shifted, and if so, why? There's certainly demand for new alternatives in these disease areas, but just curious how the economics might work now in a way that they might not have previously.
I would say that the economics are still really tough. And you mentioned antibiotics, so that's probably a good one to start with. There is a reason why we see antimicrobial resistance, and we have the issues that we have today. And there's also a reason why there is, I would say, relatively little research in the antibiotic space, because the market conditions there really drove science and innovation and companies out of that space. In a world and a place where you have to be very measured, and rightly so, because you should have very rigorous and thoughtful stewardship around antibiotics in order to minimize antimicrobial resistance. What it's led to is a market that is very small, and where where a company, a biotech company, a large company like ours, you just can't compete anymore because you have such limited ability. You have to spend a lot of money and a lot of investment to create these clinical trials that are very long, very arduous, with very high bars. And when you're done with that, you're left with a patient population that's really too small to be able to amortize the costs of everything that you've put in. And as a result, over these decades and decades of the similar situation, we are where we are today, where we have very little innovation in the antibiotic space, which is really not a great place to be in because of antimicrobial resistance, the existence of superbugs, right? So bugs that do not respond to the set of antibiotics that we have today. We are really confronted with, I think, quite a significant, question in society, which is, what are we going to do to fight the superbugs? And so you will see, in fact, I think it was yesterday, we heard from CMS that they are contemplating new pathways to generate the right incentives so that we can drive innovation and really stimulate innovation in antibiotics, because we really need it, because we don't have it. And right now we are confronted with a very significant superbug problem. So it is an example of, in fact, things haven't really changed, which is why these policy changes that we're seeing now are an important part of a long journey. But I still think that there's still a lot to be done to create the right incentives for research, for innovation, for the reimbursement of these important drugs, because this is a very significant societal issue.
So you have a new rare disease drug, Vyndaqel, on the market. This is one where you've had to do a lot of patient education to find the actual patients who need this treatment, but life-saving, not a gene therapy, but it's sort of instructive for kind of some of what you might be looking at going forward. Can you talk a little bit about your early experience with this drug on the market and how it may have been instructive for some of the new drugs that you're developing and maybe launching in coming years?
Sure. So it is exciting. Earlier this year, we launched a new drug called Vyndaqel, and it is a treatment for ATTR cardiomyopathy. Cardiomyopathy is a condition that often today gets confused with heart failure, but actually it's a very serious disease for which, until a few months ago, there was no treatment, and death was the certain path. But today, thanks to Vyndaqel, we bring new hope for patients, and patients who are able to be treated with this drug have significant benefits from a mortality perspective. It is life-saving, it is life-prolonging, and we're really proud of this invention. It is still in the rare disease space, though, so it is a drug that only affects about 100,000 people approximately in the US. But I think that what you're referring to in terms of what the lessons learned are is that it's teaching us a lot about how do you find patients, how do you diagnose patients, how do you diagnose patients in a rare disease, which is a little bit of a needle in a haystack, how do you educate physicians and the patient community around a disease that no one really focused on, and you wouldn't focus on it because there was no treatment, so it wouldn't matter if you found it. But now you can, it does matter. So how do you educate and sort of bring energy and focus around finding these patients, which are difficult to find? So it's teaching us a lot about education of new diseases, and also really creating new ways and new pathways for diagnosis. So as an example, how do you use artificial intelligence as an example to try and enrich this population? Because these patients are a needle in a haystack. Are there certain symptoms? Are there certain attributes of the patient which, if we could find them in their patient records, would help flag that this potentially is a patient with ATTR cardiomyopathy, and this is a patient that needs to be imaged? So that is an example of diagnosis in a rare disease, but actually diagnosis is important, and the use of technology in diagnosis is not just for rare diseases, as in this example I just gave. But if I think about a very common disease or common condition like atrial fibrillation, today, even with the huge numbers of patients that we treat, there are approximately probably 6 million more Americans walking around today with atrial fibrillation with the high risk of stroke that we don't even know about. And how can we use technology to monitor, to gather information around the condition of these potential patients, they're not even patients, these potential patients, to inform us as to who might be at risk and how do we find these patients. So I think the whole world of diagnosis and detection is a very exciting new area that Vyndaqel is teaching us, but honestly, it's really not just about rare diseases, it's about a lot of our diseases.
So AFib's a good segue into the topic of consumer technology. You announced a program with Bristol and with Fitbit to monitor patients, to sort of monitor people, to do a better job on detection. Talk to us a little bit about the challenges, limitations, and obviously potential upside of using consumer technology as a detection method.
Yeah. Well, we're really excited about this collaboration, both with Bristol Myers as well as Fitbit. The Fitbit technology, obviously there's a lot of technology out there that we can use and potentially still can use. But for now, what we really liked about the Fitbit technology is that it's 24/7. And because you don't have to charge your Fitbit for 2 weeks, we can collect data continuously over 2 weeks. And it's this continuous data collection that gives us the critical mass of information to help understand whether a patient could be at risk or not. So I think one thing that's exciting is really, and Fitbit is an example of that, is just wearables, right? I think in the next few years, 1 billion people will have wearables. And what do you do with wearable technology, and what doors could wearable technology open for us in terms of the information it gives us about patients and what we can do about it? And so that's an exciting beginning. But really, you could have a lot of data, but that still could get you nowhere, right? Because then it's just a lot of data. And so step 2 is about making sense of that data. And that's where a lot of work, in fact, is going on right now with Fitbit. But even beyond just atrial fibrillation, which is the example we're talking about, and many of the areas that we're investigating and researching, which is how do you make sense of this patient data? What does it tell you about the patterns of disease, their quality of life, what they're suffering with, and how does that inform us in terms of our clinical trial development, or even how we serve our patients with the drugs that we have today. So let me take another example that goes beyond Fitbit. For another one of our diseases, for rheumatoid arthritis, we are piloting what we call a digital companion. But it basically is it's a device, it's an electronic tool that captures the day-to-day and the well-being of the patient every single day. Right? So it asks the patient questions, the patient gives the answers, and over time, it's able to monitor the well-being of the patient and correlate it to the patient's routine for taking their medicines. And so in this example, what you have is a digital companion that can help a patient to be adherent to their medications and to remind them to take their medications, because maybe the reason they weren't feeling well was because they forgot to take their pill this morning, as an example. So I'm really excited about this moment when time we're in right now with technology and the applications that we have in healthcare. I mean, there are just so many incredible examples of how we're using it, not just to do research, but really to help patients live with their conditions in an easier way, to help them take their medicines in an easier way, but also importantly for us as a company, we wouldn't have done our job if we just made medicines. I think that we see our job is making sure, we use the word impact, that our patients have the outcomes that they need and that our medicines truly have the impact. And when you think about that, then we have to think about holistic solutions that really support them in their journey for taking a medication. And that's where technology can be massively helpful.